On the 28th, the Pope went to Paris, accompanied by the Emperor in the same carriage. He was lodged in the Pavillon de Flore, where, during his stay in the French capital, he received the bodies of the state, the clergy, the religious corporations, all of whom addressed him. And amongst these addresses, the speech of the president of the legislative body may be noted. A large number of people belonging to all classes of society solicited the privilege of seeing the Pope and came to ask him for his blessing each day. A crowd could be seen under his windows begging and receiving his blessings on their knees. The Pope used frequently to show himself on the balcony of the Tuileries, sometimes accompanied by Napoleon, and their appearance was always greeted with the loudest cheers. The ceremony of the coronation took place at Notre Dame on December the 2nd. The Pope went to the cathedral from the Pavillon de Flore, accompanied by a large retinue of priests and prelates in magnificent robes, preceded by his cross-bearer, who was mounted on a richly caparisoned donkey. This monk, who wore on his head a broad-brimmed hat of a rounded form, carried a large gilt cross in his hands. Public curiosity was greatly excited by the novelty of a spectacle hitherto unknown to the population of Paris. It was 3 hours later that the emperor followed the Pope from the Tuileries, driving in a state carriage glittering with plate glass and gilding, and laden with pages who hung on the doors and before and behind. The pomp of the procession was in harmony with the grandeur of the occasion. I omit the details of the ceremonies, which are to be found everywhere, and content myself with describing the most striking incident in Napoleon's coronation. The Pope, after the usual anointings and blessings, was preparing to take the crown, which was placed on the altar, when suddenly the emperor seized hold of it, placed it on his head with his own hands, and afterwards crowned Josephine himself. The Pope was reduced to the role of a mere spectator. This act, which was a reply to the objections that had been raised through the pretensions of the court of Rome, provoked a spontaneous movement of surprise amongst all present. On the eve of the coronation, the Senate had been received in solemn audience by the emperor, and the result of the voting on the establishment of the empire was presented to him. Out of a number almost equivalent to that of the citizens who had voted for the life consulate, there were only 2,000, or thereabouts, who refused to ratify by their suffrages the elevation of Napoleon to imperial rank. The days which followed on the imperial coronation were taken up with the reception of bishops, the presidents of electoral committees, the scientific bodies, and the military deputations. A distribution of the new standards, surmounted by eagles, was made on the Champ de Mars, on the regiments of all the forces, and to the National Guards of the 118 departments of the empire. On the same day, the emperor and the Pope were present together at the same table at a banquet given at the Tuileries. They were attired in their ceremonial robes and were served by the chief officers of the crown. The event, which had been accomplished, was celebrated with fêtes, displays of fireworks and illuminations. And as opposite to the emperor's coronation, I will here relate, in its simple truth, an anecdote which Napoleon's biographers have embellished in the most piquant manner. Napoleon lends himself so well to the imagination that it often goes astray when on this subject. But by investigating with an air of improbability stories which have no need of any such adornment, the great man is robbed of his originality and is reduced to a commonplace person. In this way, a denouement has been added to the anecdote to which I am alluding, a denouement alleged to have taken place at the time of his coronation, but which is a pure invention. Some days before her marriage with General Bonaparte, Madame de Beauharnais sent for her notary to talk certain matters of business over with him. When Monsieur Raguideau called, he was immediately taken up to Madame de Beauharnais, who was still in bed. The persons who were present in the room withdrew on his entry, and with the exception of a young man who escaped the notary's attention, and who placed himself in the embrasure of the window. After having spoken about certain arrangements in connection with her approaching marriage, Madame de Beauharnais asked to be told what was being said about it. Monsieur de Raguideau did not conceal the fact that her friends regretted to see her marry a penniless soldier younger than herself, whom she would be obliged to support whilst in the army, and who might be killed in war and leave her unprovided for, and with children. Madame de Beauharnais asked him if that was his opinion also. He had no hesitation in answering in the affirmative, adding that with her fortune, she had an income of about 25,000 francs, she could make a very much better match, and that he thought it was his duty, both as a matter of conscience and on account of the interest that he took in her, to make these remarks. He concluded by saying, carried away as he was by his zeal, that no doubt this officer was a very respectable man, but that, after all, his sword and his cape were his entire possessions. Madame de Beauharnais thanked him for his advice, and then with a laugh called to the young man who had remained standing before the window, drumming the panes with his fingers and apparently paying no attention to the conversation which had been going on. It is needless to add that this young man was General Bonaparte. "General," said Madame de Beauharnais, "have you heard what Mr. Raguideau has just been saying?" "Yes," he answered. "He has spoken like an honest man, and what he said makes me respect him. I hope that he will continue to take charge of our affairs, for he has disposed me to give him my confidence." Monsieur Raguideau, learning by what he had heard who this young man, whom he did not know, was rather disconcerted. He had, however, no reason to regret his frankness. Napoleon kept General Bonaparte's promises. He appointed him notary of the civil list, always treated him with kindness, and never again alluded to the circumstance by which he had made his acquaintance. This is the little story in all its simplicity. The rest does credit to the imagination of those who invented it. These relate that the emperor on the day of his coronation, clad in imperial insignia and wearing at his side the sword in which the regent diamond was set, gave himself the pleasure of sending for Monsieur Raguideau to show himself in all the splendor of his rank, and said to him in a pointed way, "Raguideau, here is the cape, and here is the sword. I regret to be forced to say that this little stroke of revenge, so wittily conceived, never entered the emperor's mind, occupied as it was with more serious thoughts. The only thing that showed that his thoughts went back to obscure days was an exclamation which he made to the dearest and most familiar of his brothers. 'Joseph,' he cried, as he looked at his brother and himself clad in the attributes of power, 'if father could see us.' This reflection was inspired less by pride than by a family feeling which in Napoleon's heart towered above the intoxication of glory and the splendors of supreme rank. The reestablishment of the monarchy rendered the adoption of a protocol or formula of the letters of the cabinet necessary. The emperor ordered me to look up at the Foreign Office and at the National Library documents and tradition, by the help of which a protocol was drawn up and adopted by him. Formerly, letters in the sovereign's handwriting were tied up, crossed with 2 silk ribbons, on the ends of which the royal seal was placed. The color of the silk was red or blue, according to the contents of the letter. The emperor gave up this practice of autograph letters, and the letters were simply placed in sealed envelopes. The height at which the first line might be commenced, the number of times that the words "Your Majesty" might be used, and other minute details were formerly matters of rigorous etiquette. The etiquette was abandoned. Sovereigns of the highest rank used to write to each other as "Sir, my brother." Those of a lesser rank were addressed as "my brother" or as "my brother and cousin," the addition of the word "cousin" being a sign of inferiority. The Tuileries cabinet adopted the use of the formula "Sir, my brother" for sovereigns of every degree. The Pope, as in the past, was addressed as "Very Holy Father," or as "Your Holiness." The letters addressed to him ending, as in the past, with the formula, "May God preserve you for long years to come in the government of our Mother, the Holy Church." Princes and princesses, the high dignitaries, the marshals and their wives, and the cardinals were addressed, as in the past, as cousins. Letters used to end with the words, "And hereupon I pray God that he may have you in his holy and worthy keeping," when addressed to the cousins, and "in his holy keep" only when addressed to others, and this formula was retained. Letters addressed by the king to persons who were not included in these various categories used formerly to begin on the first line with "Monseigneur," so-and-so, and the word Monsieur, followed by the name and title, was now attributed to everybody without distinction. These modifications and those which I have mentioned were the only concessions made to the spirit of the times. The Constitution of the new empire received its first application on the occasion of the birth of the second son of Prince Louis Bonaparte. A message from the emperor invited the Senate to register the birth of the eldest son, born under the consulate, and of his younger brother, and to deposit the deeds of registration in the archives. The Senate, in solemn audience, delivered an official certificate as to the deposit of these deeds of registration to the Arch-Chancellor and replied to the Emperor's message with its congratulations. Napoleon had profited by the circumstance of his accession to the empire to renew his proposals of peace to the King of England. He never hoped that this proposal would be crowned with entire success, but he was anxious to neglect nothing which might expose the disinclination of the British government for peace. The letter was addressed to the king and was answered by Minister Mulgrave in a letter addressed to Monsieur de Talleyrand. Its contents were to the effect that the English sovereign could not reply to the overture which had been made to him in any particular way without having communicated it to the powers with which he was allied in general, and to Russia in particular, thus refusing to express himself in any way on the emperor's proposal, and arousing the suspicion that nothing less than a new coalition might be presaged from this new understanding amongst the powers. More formal respect was shown than in preceding communications, but there was not any more sincerity than before in the desire to effect a pacification. The sessions of the Legislative Corps, which till then had been opened by the Minister of the Interior, were invested with a much more imposing character by the presence of the Emperor, who came to preside over the year 1805, sitting in person and with all the pomp of a sovereign power. On this occasion, and in order to perpetuate the memory of the benefits of the Civil Code, a statue of Napoleon was placed in the assembly room of the Legislative Corps. A special sitting at which the Empress, the princes and princesses of the imperial family, the ladies and gentlemen of their households, the Arch-Chancellor and the Arch-Treasurer were present, was devoted to the unveiling of this statue. Marshals Murat and Massena were invited by the president to draw the veil with which it was covered. Immediately after the sitting, which was held at 7 o'clock in the evening, a brilliant fete, which the emperor honored with his presence, was given in the apartments of the president. About this time, an old Corsican peasant woman, accompanied by a young woman whom she presented as her niece, was admitted to the emperor's presence. This woman was Camilla Harry, Napoleon's nurse, who wanted to see him again. He received her with the greatest kindness and embraced her most affectionately. The poor woman wept tears of joy on seeing her glorious nursling again. I was charged by the emperor to provide for her wants and her pleasures. She did not speak a word of French. She spent 3 months in Paris in perpetual enchantment. She was presented to the Pope, who took pleasure in hearing her speak, and was touched by the simplicity of her devotion. The whole court wished to see her, and she played her part very well indeed. Whilst speaking with tenderness of her foster child, she did not neglect her interests. She did not seem sorry to return to Corsica to talk about her journey there and to show off the presents and the money with which the emperor and Josephine had loaded her. Napoleon gave her the best part of his paternal inheritance on her return to Corsica. He gave the husband of her niece, whose name was Carboni, a position as tax collector at Beaucaire. Whilst the emperor was occupying himself not very long after his coronation with the reform of the religious congregations, only maintaining those which were really useful, he received a letter from the General Superior of the Jesuits, which contained an offer of the services of his order. The Jesuits were beginning to penetrate into Paris. They had already enlisted a number of young men from the schools, whom they were transforming into emissaries of the opposition against the imperial government. The emperor esteemed this religious order for the services which it rendered to education, but detested their intrigues, as they were moreover the satellites of a foreign government whose strong pretensions he had reason to fear. Napoleon forbade them to remain in France. They entered the country under different names: Fathers of the Faith, Pacarists, Ligurists, Adorers of Jesus, and so on. But his vigilance continued to keep a strict watch on their underhand practices. When either from reports addressed to him or from the newspapers he heard that some new society was establishing itself at any point in the empire, his instinct did not deceive him. The emperor then used to make haste to write to the Minister of Police or to the Minister of the Interior and blame them for their want of attention, urging them to redouble their vigilance in this matter. The care bestowed on home and foreign matters, on fetes and solemnities, were only by the way. The great object of Napoleon's solicitude remained his plan of an invasion of England. Some false maneuvers by Admiral Villeneuve, commanding the combined French, Dutch, and Spanish squadrons, made the emperor dubious of the success of his clever plan, which was to use these fleets to protect the passage of the flotilla. He was also convinced of the idea of a great expedition to India, and occupied himself for more than a month on the means of resolving difficulties of this great enterprise. He did not on that account sacrifice the Bologna expedition, but it seemed to him that an attack directed against England's distant and richest possessions might favor this expedition by drawing the entire English forces in the wake of our fleets, these taking advantage of the vastness of the ocean to escape any encounter with the English squadrons, and having landed the troops which they were to transport, were to return to our shores and help to cover with their protection the passage across the Channel. However, after having weighed the advantages and the disadvantages of an expedition to India, and taking into consideration the advanced state of the preparations for the Bologna expedition, Napoleon made up his mind to leave matters as they were, and in no way to complicate his original idea. Judging that it would be asking too much of fortune to attempt such a thing, he decided to postpone the expedition to India to some more favorable time, and impatiently awaited the arrival of the fleets commanded by Admiral Villeneuve. He was much embarrassed as to the choice of a general to direct the invasion of British India. Without doubt, he had a high appreciation of the talents of the marshals and the chief generals who had been formed in his school, but he did not consider them all to possess that combination of good qualities which were necessary for commanding a distant expedition in which they would have been left to themselves. On this occasion, I heard him regretting General Desaix, whose high capacity both as a soldier and as a politician he fully appreciated. If General Desaix had been alive at the time, it is to him that he would have entrusted the execution of his plan of campaign in 1801, which Moreau had not the courage to undertake. The remembrance of Desaix frequently came to Napoleon's mind when he was meditating some great independent military expedition. Perhaps the fact of his being deprived of the assistance of this distinguished commanding officer contributed more than once to a relinquishment of his plans, combined with the emperor's high esteem for the talents of the regretted general, was a superstition of friendship. Desaix's soul responded to his. He would have been the Hephaestion to his second Alexander. There was another matter in which the emperor was strongly interested. He was anxious to definitely settle the fate of Italy. In accordance with the wishes of the Italians, he offered the crown of Lombardy to his brother Joseph. Joseph refused it, alleging his desire to preserve his quality as a French prince and his right to succession to the throne of France, and fearing, so it is said, to alienate his new subjects by paying tribute to France, knowing how much the Italians dislike their money to be carried out of their country. His dominating motive was that he was entirely free from ambition. Napoleon, crossed in his plans and unwilling to hand over his creation to strange and possibly hostile hands, decided to join the title of King of Italy to that of Emperor of the French.